Well, Ryan, it's good to see you here on Zoom, and I'm looking forward to this series that we're going to do for however long it takes to work through a 17th century document on Trinitarian theology.
Yeah, I'm absolutely excited as well. And this is actually a document that you suggested and had discovered, and it's not normal that one is just flipping through this massive folio syntagma. So how did you come across it? What drew your eye to it? And now,
Yeah. Well, I think that I am generationally speaking at an awkward place in the sort of retrieval of serious Protestant theology that's going on right now. My students are always surprised to learn that there are giant volumes of detailed, accomplished Protestant theology back there in the Reformation and post-Reformation period. But that we can't read them unless we know Latin. And I only kind of know Latin. I'm like a C student in maybe 10th grade Latin. I taught in homeschool, I taught through the Cambridge Latin course and got, but that's not even early modern Latin. So there's particular sort of Renaissance-y and early modern kind of things that I'm cobbling together. We're kind of at a stage in this retrieval where we need to produce a lot of translations of some of these wonderful Protestant theological texts that are back there. And that's going on, right? I got Van Maastricht here. We're up to volume 2.
Nice.
Which is the Trinity stuff here at the end.
I just signed up to review that. So it's in the mail.
It's fantastic.
Good.
Just good readable English. And there it is. It's, couldn't do that before 2019.
Todd was actually the guy who taught me Latin.
Oh, great.
So, and you're right. Like, I'm so conscious of the fact that a generation before me, very, very few know Latin. But then the other thing is we actually have access to all these sources today, like online, which is just ridiculous. I am pulling up books on Google Books that were digitally scanned in like 4 or 5 years ago, and they have not been looked at for 300-400 years, you feel, except for some random monk in a library. But the fact that we can sit on our iPad or print them off, I like to print off the books off Google Books because you can have, it's like $10 and they're right there. And it's definitely a sea change in scholarship, especially for recovery Protestant Orthodoxy. Yeah.
So a couple of sources for those of us who have to do most of our work in English. Of course, Richard Muller's 4-volume Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics. He talks you through for hundreds and hundreds of pages. He talks you through what's out there, and he'll trace a subject and he'll tell you, and this is in Polanus. And I'll say, ooh, Polanus, is that in English? And I see that it's not. So I go to prdl.org, the Post-Reformation Digital Library, and I find the PDFs and I climb my way through them the best I can. And that's kind of how I found Amandus Polanus's Syntagma, this great theological work that he wrote. It shows up a lot. It shows up a lot in Muller, and it shows up a lot in Barth. So Karl Barth, when he began teaching in Basel, thought, okay, time to get serious now about being a Reformed theologian from Basel. Let me read a handful of the great Reformed thinkers who have taught here before. And so early on, he picked up Polanus. And so I think I saw that Polanus is quoted in every part volume of the Church Dogmatics.
Really? Okay.
So if you've read a lot of Barth, which is a lot of my formation in 20th century theology, you're used to seeing this name over and over as someone worth going to. But then you just hit the wall of Latin because it's not been translated.
Yeah, and like you and I were discussing a little bit beforehand at one point, and we were talking about lack of translations of Amandus Polanus and the Syntagma specifically, or broadly, just anything by Polanus. And I wasn't aware there's actually, you pointed out, an English translation, an old English translation. But apart from that, I think the only translation that exists of anything is actually on my laptop right now. It's the essence, it's the Essence and Attributes of volume 2 of the Syntagma, which I have translated. I'm waiting for a publisher to pick it up sometime. And then this piece that we're talking about today, which we're going to be publishing online, and working through together. So
so I was looking through Polanus on the Trinity, just kind of skimming it to see where I would want to dig in deeper, because it's a lot of work for me to make the decision to dig in deeper to a Latin passage. So skimming and trying to get my bearings and outlining a little bit. And it was all making sense how he laid out his discussion. It's nice and long. One of the best things about Polanus is it's lengthy. It goes into detail. And I reached a certain point in the discussion, and I hit this chapter called 18 Axioms on the Trinity. And I thought, what are these 18 axioms on the Trinity? Is this how he ends his treatise? And then I looked, and no, there's another half of the treatise goes on after that. So right in the middle of his treatment of the doctrine, he's got these 18 axioms. So I thought, well, is this the secret sauce? Like, is this where it all comes together? How good are these? I don't know anything about 18 axioms. I would have thought there'd be fewer or more. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's kind of a random
I sent you an
number,
email
too.
and said, Ryan, what is this? Here's what I think's happening. Can you tell me what's actually happening in it?
Yeah.
And so we've had a little discussion about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's turned out they're not axioms like we normally think about them today. They're very long paragraphs that are kind of summary statements, and one in particular, I think it's Axiom 14, is super long.
Yeah,
it's almost as long as 50% of the axioms in total.
But now the whole set together, all 18 axioms, comes to something like 6,000 words. Is that right?
Yeah.
Translated in an English translation that you've put together, which we will be debuting here through this set of conversations and the accompanying blog posts, making Polanus's 18 axioms available.
Yeah.
So there you go. Breaking news.
Yeah.
Fresh from the 17th century.
And, we're talking about Amandus Polanus quite a lot, but it occurs to me that we haven't actually really introduced the guy. So, you know quite a bit about Polanus. I know a little bit about Polanus. Who was he broadly? Why is he important? What's going on with him?
Yeah, so he's one of these post-Reformation Reformed dogmaticians. He actually was a professor of Old Testament in Basel. So most of his teaching was in that chair. But he's best, and he wrote a lot of commentaries on Old Testament books. Yeah. But he's most famous as a systematic theologian, and specifically for this long work, the Syntagma. So his dates, he lived 1561 to 1610.
Yeah, he died when he was 48.
Yeah,
48. Right. 1 year younger than Thomas Aquinas. Thomas died when he was 49.
These guys who wrote these big jumbo books and then died before 50.
It's remarkable. Syntagma is so huge.
He wrote a few works on logic. He wrote some commentaries. The thing you mentioned earlier, Ryan, he wrote a short theological work called the Partitiones Theologicae, the divisions of theology. And that was translated as early as 1595.
It's kind of a strange title, isn't it? Why do you, with the divisions?
Yeah, and he changed when he reissued it later. It got a little bigger, but then after he published the whole Syntagma, he decided he'd publish a really short version of the Partitiones. I guess he figured he'd set it all in the big book. But yeah, as early as 1595, this thing was available in English. So I think you have to go on Early English Books Online to get the PDF of it. It's not linked through PRDL. But at least it's Polanus in English, and it's pretty helpful stuff, though it's one of those gnarly old, scanned PDFs.
Yeah, I've not looked at that myself. I've, of course, looked at the Syntagma, read a fair amount of it. I must confess I've not read the entirety, but that's where, it seems like he was kind of building up for it. So if I recall, he published a couple editions of the Partitiones, or the divisions of theology, and he kind of pulled a Calvin move where he was developing his systematics all throughout his life, like Calvin did with the Institutes. Yeah. And then he switches over, and I don't know, I'll have to ask a better historian than myself why the switch from Partitiones, which is where, divisions of theology, he's approaching things in a bit more of a Ramist way. And then he switches over to something called a Syntagma, which is a Greek word just for system. And it's much different in its feel and its presentation. For instance, the book 2, the whole Syntagma is comprised of 10 books. Book 1 is basically Prolegomena. Book 2 is Essence and Attributes. And then book 3 is Trinity, where this piece is found. But like if you go back to the Essence and Attributes, he always starts off with the definition of an attribute, and then he expounds it, and then he concludes with these uses or these applications. So the pattern is very fascinating.
And that's that's in the Syntagma. In the Partitiones, it's a little, you said it's Ramist. It's it's that dichotomizing, like,
I love
theology
those
is both
French brackets.
theoretical and practical.
That's
And
right.
so there's actually, I think, 25 pages of diagrams
Oh my
of
goodness.
how every concept he's analyzing ramifies out into, this has two parts, and each part has two parts, and each of those parts has two parts. Sometimes it'll be three parts. You either love that or hate it. And he apparently went through this phase where he loved it.
Yeah.
I mean, on the upside, there's some analytic clarity that it brings.
Yeah.
It gives you something to talk about, especially as a teacher.
Yeah, heuristically as
and it
well.
also guarantees that there's like practical application, because one of the things that Promised would do is say, we consider this theoretically and we consider it practically. So,
yeah, and that I mean, one of the main contributions of the Reformed scholastics, in contrast, for instance, to the earlier reformers themselves, is a bit more of a resurgence of scholasticism. So I always think of scholasticism as somewhat becoming buried a little bit in the 16th century. And then as the Reformation project continues, it starts to rise in the Protestant ranks once again. And we have guys like Polanus, who was one of the most significant earlier figures. But just because there's a strong return of this detailed scholastic approach to problems and questions and working out things, doesn't mean it's no longer that practical piety that we found so strongly in the reformers as well.
Oh yeah, in fact, I think it's more woven into the syntagma. So instead of having a here's the doctrine, here's the practice, kind of that fits your chart.
Yeah.
The practical element is more built in. And we mentioned Maastricht earlier, Van Maastricht. He's it's theoretical - practical theology.
Yeah.
So that's later on in this movement. Where everyone's kind of trying to find ways to not merely be intellectualist about it, to keep theology practical.
Yeah.
But to also coordinate that with the kind of scholastic carefulness, precision, and elaboration that they're pursuing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about that unique union and how the Reformed Orthodox of the 17th, 18th century were able to pull that off, especially when I think about Trinity today. For us, there's not that unified approach. Either we have a strong functionalizing of Trinity, where it's all application, it's all about forming a society in light of who God is or something along those lines, or it tends to be very dry and arid and divorced from the actual life of piety. So maybe that's one area that these Reformed Orthodox can really help contribute to our conversation.
I think your point's good. Whether in academic theology or sort of at the church level, modern Trinitarianism really developed around this idea that there's a way of teaching the Trinity that just establishes that God is triune, and it didn't have any
just
application built in as you were going along. It didn't have any methodological enrichment. It didn't sort of draw you into the subject matter. So the idea is that you have this doctrine you inherit, that's set. Now the question is, how do you close the application gap? And kind of in one big step, there's the Trinity. Now how do you apply it? And the answer is well, it's like an apple, for the kids service, or it's, it's like a community fellowship for the adult service, or it's like, it's our
male
political
and female
program.
relations. Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
We got to have that.
Or in academic theology, it is our social program.
Yes.
And I think that does come from this. Here's the doctrine. Now you make this giant jump to how to apply it. Whereas through the Reformed Orthodox, you get lots of different little moves all the way along to kind of get into the subject matter.
Here's a question maybe you've got some insight on. I've been thinking about John Webster a lot just recently, in his whole project of theological theology, which of course, is very familiar to most people in conversations of doctrine of God these days. How do you see an approach to theological theology fitting in to this issue of the life of piety? John Webster, whatever he was doing, he's just always able to pull it off to where it was always worshipful, it was always applicational, but it was never just listing applications at the end tacked on. And the Reformed Orthodox also seem to be pulling it off. So how are they doing it? You say it's woven in, more integrated. What do you think's going on with that?
Yeah, it's woven in. I think something it's about the power of attention that they're focusing so much on. it's biblical. They're exegeting text,
Mhm.
but more to the point, it's like they're trying to talk rationally about a spiritual apprehension of something.
Mm.
And I do think that's something you get in Webster too, right?
Mhm.
You get a couple pages into one of his accounts, and you think it's not like he's having a vision, but it's like he's got a
Having a
grasp of
spiritual
eternal generation or
experience.
whatever, and he's describing that. Yeah. The other thing I would say about theological theology and someone like Polanus, I can't do the stats, but he mostly writes about the doctrine of God. It's
No.
um, so even when he does what's supposed to be a complete systematic theology, it is dominated just in terms of page count by
Mhm.
what he has to say about theology proper or the doctrine of God.
Yeah.
I mean, almost too much, like especially when I look at some versions of
Oh no.
the substance of theology, the 1595 English translation.
Yeah.
You get it and think this is going to be the whole systematic theology, and it's like 50% doctrine of God, which is really bracing, coming at it
Mhm.
from a modern perspective. Like, yeah, that would make sense
Finally,
because,
someone is
yeah,
thinking about this.
God's the biggest thing here we're going to talk about, right? So he actually allows the doctrine of God to loom very large in his overall thought.
Yeah.
And even when he gets to later subjects, he's established an order of operations by which he first goes back and tags the doctrine of God and
Mhm.
then moves forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so here we are talking about Polanus. We've translated these 18 axioms. We're taking the time to work through them bit by bit. I presume that both of us have feelings that these are worthwhile to inject in the contemporary conversation on doctrine of God and Trinity. What are some areas where, maybe abstracting from Polanus a little bit, just the Reformed Orthodox in general can offer some helpful uh, food for thought for contemporary work on Trinity, whether that's uh, criticism, like negative and mistakes that people are making, or positive ways that we can continue to amplify their approach to the treatment of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they had some things sort of joined up or worked out together that we think of more as separate. So, when I was studying Trinitarian theology in the 90s, the word you heard about what they did was that they divided the doctrine of the one God from the doctrine of the triune God.
Right.
And that's actually
But
probably the first
you did your
place
dissertation on Rahner, so you know that very,
that's right.
very well.
Yeah, yeah. Turns out that isn't really fair to what any of the
Yeah.
people who were
No one
organizing their
ever
tables
did
of
that.
contents this
No
way.
one
Yeah,
ever did that. And
yeah. First place I ran into Polanus actually is he's got such a large doctrine of the one God in the Syntagma that he does.
yeah,
I don't want to say all the attributes because you can't do all. I mean, what are all the divine attributes? But
sure.
he does all the major ones, all the ones that there are traditional developments
Yeah.
of. He just has lots of pages on each of them, and it's only in really large systems of theology that you get the attribute of blessedness, which is one of
Mm.
my key topics that I focus on. Polanus is the Protestant theologian who stood out. Of course, Aquinas has it,
Mm-hmm.
but Polanus is one of the Protestants who stood out as having really worked on the doctrine of divine blessedness
Mm-hmm.
as the last thing he does in the doctrine of the one God before then turning the corner to enter the doctrine of the triune God.
I've translated it, but I hadn't noticed that
Yeah.
yeah, and okay, I'll have to think about that more.
Yeah.
Um, you're right to bring up this issue of the unity versus the Trinity, the oneness versus threeness of God. It's something that has fascinated me for years as well. This weird 20th century, almost a fetishism, where we have the Eastern-Western divide, seemingly between a personalist versus an essentialist view of who God is. We've got Rahner beating the drum. We need to Christianize the doctrine of God finally, and pull the unity of God and all of the essential attributes, which Thomas Aquinas is located all the way over here in the separate treatment. You have to pull that over and like form them with a Christian stamp and these sorts of things. And one thing that stood out to me so much in Polanus's treatment, it's not only like everyone almost starts with the oneness of God, all the essential attributes, and the move to Trinity, because it's just what we do for theological reasons as well. It's not just heuristic. But he also, his first axiom is really, really concerned of this move of foregrounding Trinity, the threeness of God over the oneness of God, and relating them together in a proper way. And so he says, right off, we can talk about the word Trinity, and it can mean different things, and we need to make sure we know what we want to signify. It does not signify a unity of three. That's what he says, first of all. And I take that to mean, we'll talk about it more, I suppose, later. I don't want to give away all of that beforehand, but
Yeah.
No, but the Trinity is never resolved into a unity, is what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's so valuable that he's formed already by commitments in the doctrine of God. And so when he gets to even the word Trinity in our first axiom, it's like, well, you could use that in the wrong way. This is not, any old kind of threeness or triplicity here, or threefoldness or any of that. And it's because he knows that in order to get this right, he's got, I think you've called them sort of guideposts in place, that there are lines in place for whatever we say about the threeness of the persons, it's going to happen within the oneness of God that we already know. That's our starting point. That's how we're getting to where we're getting to.
Yeah. I read an article a few months ago or something. It was lauding, Kate Sonderegger's work, who, she's great. Her treatment on Trinity is coming out here in just a month or so. I'm excited to read. But lauding her as this incredible theologian of the oneness of God. And it struck me as so unique and surprising that was actually a notable statement that people felt like they need to draw attention to. Of course, no offense to what Dr. Sonderegger is doing. I think what she's doing is great. But the fact that has to be called attention to today is illustrative of some of the mistakes, also of approach and method, and some of these more basic issues to approaching something like the doctrine of the Trinity, which has been unhooked from the fundamental unity of God, which is in no wise become a composite based upon the fact that there are three persons.
Yeah, what's so unique about Sonderegger's work is that she's doing this after Barth and Rahner and Pannenberg and Moltmann, right? To come back and say, let's shift the emphasis here and approach this other way. So in that regard, really encouraging to see her project.
Yeah.
Well, let me say one thing about the 18 axioms and sort of where they fit. What caught my eye originally is I'm going through this 11-point doctrine of the Trinity. There are like 11 chapters, I guess, within the book on the Trinity. And everything's kind of makes sense. He's talking about the definition of person is where Polanus decides to start his overall treatise on the Trinity. And he works through the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And then he's got a whole chapter on the Holy Trinity, and he deals with lots of things there. Then all of a sudden it's chapter, 8 is axioms on the Holy Trinity. Then he goes on to chapter 9 and does 3 more big chapters of stuff. And so I thought, well, what is that doing there? Having worked through it a couple of times now, I realized, okay, he already sort of did his basic doctrine of the Trinity in chapters 1 through 6, or 7, sorry. And then he's going to go and refute a lot of counterpoints. So he's going to, he's been positive, then he's about to go negative. One of the things that's going to make the book so long is he's got a lot of false views to refute. He's got a lot of controversies to settle. Disputes, right? And right in between the positive and the negative, he inserts these axioms. So it seems to me that what he's doing is sort of drawing together and summing up what he's accomplished in his positive treatment of the doctrine of the Trinity in longer form. It doesn't totally recapitulate, certainly doesn't recapitulate the structure of the previous chapters, but I think he's trying to sort of pull it all together from another analytic viewpoint before he goes on to do the negative thing. I think broadly, architecturally, that's what it's doing where it is.
I think so. And even the word he chooses to use, axiomata, it's kind of difficult to translate because it's axioms is the word we want to go for, and that's totally appropriate, of course, but it's more like guiding principles is kind of what it means, or rules, or summary statement, something along those lines, which is exactly what you're describing as far as its function at the seam between positive articulation and then dealing with all these objections. We have some guiding fundamental principles that we're going to be referring to throughout these objections.
I noticed, because I was reading this on PDF, I noticed I did a control F, I did a search for the word, and he also does something like it in the essence and attributes section, I think.
He does. Yeah, I translate.
It's not as long,
corollary.
but yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see. What else do we want to say just by way of introduction?
Well, I found maybe some of the sources or some of the texture that brings, Polanus brings so many different figures into this piece. And one of the things I find really valuable about these 18 axioms is, on the one hand, they're guiding principles and they're articulating these boundary lines of orthodoxy. But on the other hand, there's a lot of diversity that is allowed, or he chooses various options that are permitted within the orthodox goalposts, as it were. And looking at some of the sources he's using helps illumine some of the underlying texture and structure and various figures that he's relying on, and different options for explaining more detailed issues to try to work this out fully. So just some things that I noticed. He, of course, relies very heavily on Augustine, especially on the issue of appropriation. Like I didn't take the time to check, go back to reading Augustine's De Trinitate, but when I was translating the section on appropriation, which is coming near the end, I mean, he must have had the De Trinitate either ringing in his head or literally sitting on his desk, because I was hearing it in my head.
Yeah.
And so
and some of that, I think Lombard sentences, there are whole pages
Definitely.
of it which are just block quotes from Augustine. And so it had entered into the tradition in more direct ways than just Consulting Augustine himself. Yeah,
that's right. That's really important. You don't know where he's getting the ideas he is. A few other guys he's really relying on. He's following Thomas on what's come to be known as the relations account. So Thomas is famous for making the divine relations the actual place where we constitute divine persons. So there are a number of things which distinguish persons. There's only one that constitutes them. And
people have started using the category recently, Reformed Thomism. And I'm I've only looked at Trinity section mostly, but I'm assuming that Polanus is in that Reformed Thomism movement. I mean, Thomas plays so heavily, at least in this section, that in my mind, that's kind of where I've located him.
He does. It's interesting because, so for instance, he follows Thomas on relations over against, for instance, a Bonaventura who's going to be constituting the divine persons by origin. And then there's a few other options, but they're more minority views. And it's unlikely, for instance, that Polanus was reading Johannes de Rada, which has the persons constituted by an absolute and these sorts of things. So it's not likely. I'd be very surprised if he had access to that idea where he was in kind of history. But so he follows Thomas on the one hand, but then he doesn't follow Thomas. He follows Bonaventure against Thomas on the issue of the divine missions, which he's dealing with very, very late. So Bonaventure says that the effect involved in a mission, a divine mission, is going to be a new manifestation of the person. And Thomas is very, very much opposed to that. It's actually a new presence. And Polanus is clearly either quoting Bonaventure or getting it from somewhere else, but he sides with Bonaventure on that issue.
So he goes manifestation instead of presence?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's
also interesting. I mean, Bonaventure and Thomas are both 13th century, but it's hard to remember when you're dealing with someone who wrote around 1600. They've got not only high scholasticism, but 300 years of commentary and development.
Oh, yeah.
To draw on.
Yeah, absolutely. So
nobody reads De Rada, right?
You would be finding it in all the commentators. Yeah. So when you're reading a Banez or Zumel or Suarez or something like that, they're going to be commenting on Johannes de Rada. But you're right. It's very unlikely that he would have access to that script. But everyone's copying each other's works.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe there's some sources. What are some summary or high points that you picked out?
Oh, yeah.
Our appetite.
I was going to say, you mentioned in some of the notes we sent back and forth that he's got a long quote from Gabriel Biel,
Yeah.
So we've got, what do you want to say, some kind of nominalism, or?
I'm very fascinated. I think it's the only, certainly the only lengthy quote, and it was a beast to translate. Let me
Yeah, is
tell
that all in
you.
14, the really long axiom, or? I can't remember where the Beale quote
No,
is.
I think it's before Axiom
Okay,
14, if
yeah.
I recall.
Well, I mean, I know from Muller that I should expect eclecticism in a figure
Mm-hmm.
like this. And
Mm-hmm.
so while, I tend to think he's probably a Reformed Thomist, um, it's going to be hard to pigeonhole. And even his interest in Ramism means, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, people got really opinionated about Ramism, whether it was the way of doing Aristotle
Yeah.
now or whether it was a counter
Right.
tradition to Aristotelian analysis. So, but I mean, those are all conversations that I see them from afar, and I think I should remember that my author has opinions about that and cares.
Yeah.
I probably don't exactly care, but it is going to be eclectic, I think.
Yeah. And, all of our work on Trinity is going to be eclectic. It's going to be located within, the broader creedal articulation of what has to be affirmed dogmatically. And then there's going to be a lot of similarities in how we work things out. But as soon as you start pushing, it's one of the genius of scholasticism and why it's so useful to study, is that they've pushed the question so far along various alternate paths that you can really see where an option takes you, whether that's a good place or a bad place. And just as it works out, it's quite helpful.
Yeah. I think early on in the Axioms, he rings the changes on the word homoousios. So
He
he's
does.
really committed to consubstantiality, one essence. But then he does like heterousios,
I know there were
homoiousios.
some I wasn't even familiar.
I had never
Soon
seen any of them.
Usias, is with, yeah, there was a number of them.
Apparently, sumousios is a problem. So
Yeah.
it's when I first read him, I was still thinking, is this a way I could use to teach the doctrine of the Trinity in some
Yes.
contexts? And I decided not without a lot of work digesting this and kind of rephrasing it, but I might use that
Okay.
homoousios thing. I might, because when you're teaching, here's what we are affirming.
Totally. And
To
here's what we're
say,
not
here
affirming.
are
Boom,
6
boom,
things that we're
boom.
not saying when we say
Yeah.
homoousios.
Yeah.
These would be other Greek words that you can now write down in your notebook, which
Yeah.
we are not teaching. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, everyone likes their Greek words.
That's right.
You have to have
Well,
the Greek words.
you're learning if you got a word for it. That's right. Yeah.
Oh my.
How about
Yeah.
you? Anything stand out from your overview of it?
I'm really, I'm just excited to dive in and kind of pick apart. I really liked, as I mentioned, the non-unity of 3, which he mentions straight off. It's like the first line. I find it interesting him doing the issues with the manifestation versus the presence thing. So he decides against Thomas. Whether he's conscious of that or not is an interesting question. I tend to think he's not, because he's clearly steeped in the high medieval scholastics, either directly or indirectly through, neo-scholastics in the 16th century that he's reading, but he's nowhere near the precision that those high medievals are using at a point. So for instance, Thomas, and any trained Thomist knows that when we talk about the divine relations, we talk about them constituting. That's the word that is dropped in Thomas's Summa. That's the word that everyone talks about, constituting divine persons. But Polanus doesn't use that word. He says that all the other distinctions that pertain to persons, like their notions and the processions and origin, flow from the relations fundamentally. So he holds up relations and that's a unique way to approach the problem is, so we start with the relations that constitute, which he's not saying, but by default, constitute the divine persons is really distinct. And then everything else is distinct as a consequence. And so querying those sorts of things is going to be interesting.
Nice. Yeah. All the way from processions to missions there. When I think about how you describe missions, I know that's late in the game for the series we're going to be talking about, but it aligns, I think, with a certain evangelical level, popular level use of Jesus, having an experience of meeting Jesus, right?
Yes.
I want to be able to put that back into the framework of Trinitarian missions and say, not just the visible mission of the Son in the incarnation, but, I always teach, when I'm teaching this, I say, that day in 1985 in Kentucky when I got saved, did the Father send the Son to me? And in what sense? Was it a presence? Was it a manifestation?
Right.
There's a certain popular level way of talking about it that's got
Right.
some really strong roots in some pretty thoughtful piety of
Definitely.
the Protestant
And
evangelical tradition.
real Christian experience that's meaningful.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
we're planning to work through these, broadly speaking, over the next several weeks or maybe several months. Maybe we give a little bit of summary of what's to come.
Oh yeah. Let's see. Well, you did the translation, so what? Oh, that's right. You can break these into groups, right?
Yeah. Well, I
The
think
18
there's
axioms.
I think there's maybe 3 rough sections. It's very lopsided. That's something you mentioned to me as well. It's like Axiom 14 is this massive one, and then others are really short, and you'd expect them to be long. And then he has this very long articulation of all these different Greek words. So it's kind of a rough way of dividing, but I think maybe 3 sections that kind of stand out to me. The first one is kind of the time he spends dealing with homoousios and affirming that, to make clear that though the persons are really distinct, they're in no wise going to be distinguished essentially in any way. So the first section really hammers that home. We're not distinguishing the persons essentially by essence. Everything essential, everything absolute about God, all of his perfections that are absolute formalities are going to be absolutely common to the divine persons and only rationally distinguished from them. So the formality of a relation which constitutes the divine person is only rationally distinct from the underlying essence that it's in. So he's very clear about that. And then maybe the second section, he's actually working to distinguish the persons. And that's where he brings in the relations account. And then the third section, he works on comparing persons to the essence and to each other. And that's where things like perichoresis come up.
Picking through what kind of distinctions we're making when we distinguish persons from each other and from the essence. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's good by way of introduction. And for our next one, we'll jump into the first axiom and see what there is to say about it.
Absolutely. I think the first axiom probably deals, if I had to have a title card, it would be what actually does the word Trinity really signify? What does it really mean? And he has quite a long section on what it really means. So
yeah, great.
All right. Well, I guess we'll look forward to that and working through that next time.
All right. Good talking to you, Ryan.
Yep. Bye. All right.